Yeah, thanks very much, Michelle. I think it's crucial for us to understand the role of the corporations if we want to understand the power relations in this massive arms deal, which has happened almost 20 or concluded almost 20 years ago. Thales, of course, is one of the globe's most important arms companies and certainly one of the most important arms companies in France. It's part state-owned, so it's not just a private corporation. And it was involved in selling weapons in South Africa during apartheid, very active here, using its former name, Thomson CSF, and saw a new market in a democratic South Africa. And so when the government administration of Nelson Mandela, and particularly quite aggressively under the leadership of Deputy President Thabo Mbeki at the time, pursued the idea of a so-called strategic defense procurement package, buying planes and ships and submarines, so a range of weapons which many have argued the country couldn't use or didn't need or certainly didn't want at the time, given our other pressing needs as a country in terms of socioeconomic needs, and which remain. The decision was to include Thales. They're not one of the big suppliers, so they haven't supplied the submarines, for example, but they've supplied the combat suite on the frigates, on those warships that lie in languish in the harbour in Simonstown, if you like, the brains within these warships as such. And of course, the manner in which Thales achieved this tender has always been open to question. And Michelle, we should add, it wasn't only Thales, it was British Aerospace, a number of German arms companies, Ferrostal, and others, the Swedish arms company Saab, a big Italian arms company who were involved. So they do not stand alone accused of corruption, but there is strong evidence that they not only worked very closely with a man called Shabir Sheikh, who was Jacob Zuma's financial advisor, and which court records have showed paid him an amount of money often on a monthly basis over a 4 or 5 year period, perhaps investing in a politician. But most importantly, to conclude, Michelle, that Thales, through Shabir Sheikh, had agreed to pay Jacob Zuma an amount of, back then in the early 2000s, late 1990s, of about 500,000 Rand a year, specifically to ensure that Thales is never held to account for any alleged corruption in the arms deal.
Yeah, it's very interesting, Henny. In this article written by Open Secrets, you talk about the fact that Thales has, just like Jacob Zuma has done, has for almost 2 decades pleaded innocence in terms of how it conducted its business in South Africa. And yet, it's not the first time the company was implicated in corruption.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think, we need to appreciate that this is often reduced, as we've often argued, to the Jacob Zuma trial, whereas, of course, it's a trial that involves both Jacob Zuma, a very powerful politician, but as I've said, a very powerful arms company. And they, too, have gladly played along in the Stalingrad, so-called Stalingrad strategy, which the president's lawyers have pursued. I should say until most recently, earlier this year, or in January this year, rather, where they decided they would not appeal a decision where they had lost an attempt to try and have charges of racketeering and other serious charges against them withdrawn. And so that is why they are finally in the dock with the president, at least in the pre-trial hearing process that starts today. But, as you said, they have been linked not only to corruption in South Africa, but in a number of other countries. They wouldn't be stand alone as arms companies linked to corruption, not only in the South African deal, but because it's very much in the DNA of the way in which many big arms companies operate when it comes to these clandestine, secretive arms deals, often concluded behind closed doors, which suits, frankly, corrupt politicians and suits the arms companies because they know they can bag the deals they want as long as they can pay off the right people along the process. And that is certainly always the trick. But as I pointed out, Thales's history in South Africa does stretch way back, as do many other companies. And maybe it points again to the reason why this arms deal was the bridge between the corruption and illicit procurement of weapons during the sanctions embargo against the apartheid state and state capture, which we've seen more recently. The arms deal really was a way for many of those companies that had made themselves very wealthy off the back of South Africa's suffering during the last years of apartheid by supplying weapons to the regime, who found ways to ingratiate themselves with our new leaders in a democratic South Africa. And, very, very clearly that helped to poison, as they say, the well of our politics. It's resulted in cultures of corruption. And of course, it's not only a culture of corruption, Michelle, but it's also resulted in politicians like Jacob Zuma and others fighting, and I use that word with care, but certainly struggling over many years to ensure that they are never held to account for this alleged corruption, and in that process, destroying many of the country's democratic institutions. The NPA and others were not only destroyed to protect state capture, so certainly it benefited the Guptas, as it has many big companies who didn't pay the tax they should, so-called legitimate big corporations in Sandton and Cape Town.
Yeah.
But it certainly did ensure that these charges didn't stick on the president during that time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or time.
I mean, Henny, for ordinary South Africans who are trying to keep track of this decades-long story now, I think the biggest question that we often get is, why has this case dragged on for such a long time when the person who was convicted of being the middleman in these bribes from Thales to Jacob Zuma, that's Schabir Shaik, was convicted as far back as 2005. Here we are in 2021. We're about to hopefully see a trial date set.
Yeah, Michelle, 15 years. I mean, it is quite extraordinary. And it's understandable that many people say, why continue with this process? Surely there are other matters that we need to look at. And I think there are a couple of things for us to consider. The one is that there are very few instances anywhere in the world where big arms companies and important politicians are held to account for corruption in these type of arms deals. In a way, they're often seen as almost operating well beyond the realm of the law, or the kind of law that would hold you or I or any one of the viewers this morning to account. And so what South Africa is doing is, I think, is significant, because you could focus very narrowly on the woes of former President Jacob Zuma, as he and certainly a small group of his supporters wish us to do, to paint him as a victim. But clearly, the prosecution of both Thales and Jacob Zuma means that you have an African country which is holding a global arms company to account for its alleged corruption in a major deal that's impacted the human rights of millions of South Africans. And I think, firstly, that politically is hugely significant. It shows the willingness of our judiciary to tackle the powerful. And let's put Jacob Zuma aside for a moment. Thales is, as I said, hugely significant in this prosecution process. And so therefore, that is one reason, because that's how you put a stop to this type of behavior once corporations like this know that they will be held to account in this process. And very clearly, once politicians know that they too cannot just try and kind of wing their way and ensure there's no prosecution. And certainly the delay tactics over the last 15 years, this famous Stalingrad strategy of Jacob Zuma, and I would argue Thales as well, must have been coordinated at times, or certainly served both their interests. That was the primary question of there suddenly being, and there's some people have argued it's a sudden, quick political prosecution. Many of the prosecutors involved were those who had been attempting to prosecute this in 2005, 2006, this matter, but were effectively stymied by political interference within the NPA. If anything, this and other prosecutions in the arms deal should be an indication of renewed culture of integrity that's hopefully manifesting within the National Prosecuting Authority.
Yeah, absolutely. It's got repercussions for our judiciary and far-reaching as well, as you say, an African country holding a global corporation to account. Henny van Vuuren, it's always a great pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much for putting it in perspective for us.